Hello, everybody. So welcome to the second half of the respiratory system lecture. Okay, today we're going to talk about pulmonary ventilation. And pulmonary ventilation is basically your breathing, right? So your breathing occurs in this repetitive cycle that includes inspiration, which is the inhaling of air, and expiration, which is the exhaling of air. The respiratory cycle is what we call one complete repetitive cycle, right? When you complete inspiration and expiration, we call that a respiratory cycle. We have different types of respiration. One is called quiet respiration. Okay, that's when you're breathing when you're at rest. It's somewhat effortless. You don't think you're not thinking about it. It's automatic. And then you have forced respiration. Okay, these are deep, rapid breaths, things that you would do maybe during exercise, or if you would just, done running, or if you're excited. Okay, things that aren't necessarily normal when you're at rest. Okay, the flow of air in and out of the lungs is going to depend a lot on pressure differences inside your body and outside your body. The respiratory muscles that you have, excuse me, are going to help change the volumes of your lungs and create different pressures that are relative to your outside atmospheric pressure. Okay, so the one muscle that we all think about when we talk about respiratory muscles, and it's the most important one, is the diaphragm. Okay, the diaphragm is this muscle that lies underneath your rib cage, or at the very base of your rib cage. Okay, it is the prime mover of respiration. When your diaphragm contracts, okay, it actually flattens out and goes down. Okay, and when you flatten out your diaphragm, it increases the amount of volume in your thoracic cavity. Because this is a vacuum, because inside of your thoracic cavity is a vacuum, when your diaphragm lowers, it's actually going to cause air to get sucked into your mouth. Okay, so when you lower the diaphragm, it's like if you ever had a turkey baster or a pipette, and you squeeze the ball of the pipette, and then you release that bulb of the pipette or the turkey baster, liquid gets sucked into that little tube, right? Same thing's happening with your diaphragm, right? So when you exhale, your diaphragm goes up, okay? It goes up and it pushes it pushes the air out of your lungs. So it's like pushing the bulb down on that pipette or that turkey baster. When you release the pressure off the turkey baster, or when you release the pressure off the diaphragm and the diaphragm goes downwards, it's actually going to suck air into the pipette or suck air into your lungs. Okay, so that's what happens when your diaphragm goes down. Okay, when your diaphragm goes down and contracts, it sucks air into your lungs. It causes the volume in your thoracic cavity to increase, thus air goes in. When you relax your diaphragm goes up, and that it compresses the lungs because the volume of the thoracic cavity shrinks. That squeezes the lungs essentially and forces air out of the lungs, out of your mouth, and you can expel that air. This muscle, your diaphragm, accounts for 2/3 of all of the airflow in your system. Okay, the other 1/3 is going to be caused by different respiratory muscles. Okay, the internal and external intercostal muscles. These are located between your rib cage, or between each one of your ribs. You have internal and external intercostals, right? The internal ones are going to be more deep. The external ones will be more superficial. That's why they're called internal and external. They are synergists to the diaphragm. Synergist means they work together with the diaphragm. They do the same function as the diaphragm. They increase or decrease thoracic volume. Okay, an antagonist would do the opposite, right? So a bicep and a tricep are antagonists. They do opposite movements. Okay, but synergists are going to do the same movements as each other. Okay, they're going to help to stiffen the thoracic cage during respiration. That's going to help like internal collapse. Okay, we don't want internal collapse of the thoracic cavity. So those muscles in between your ribs are going to help prevent caving in when the diaphragm goes down. Okay, we don't want anything like that to happen. They're going to contribute to the enlargement and the contraction of the thoracic cavity. Okay, they're going to help expand that thoracic cavity during inhalation. And again, that's about 1/3 of the air that ventilates through the lungs. Okay, there are other muscles, and I'm going to show you pictures of these, called scalenes. These are also synergists to the diaphragm. They're really high. They're in your neck. Okay, they originate on the base of the skull. Okay, they insert onto your first and second ribs, and they're going to help to elevate your first and second ribs up. So every time you inhale, your first two ribs are slightly moving up to increase that. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase volume, right? So we want to expand that rib cage as much as possible to get as much air into our lungs, and those scalene muscles are going to help do that. So here's a picture of those muscles. Okay, so we can see they originate on the cervical vertebrae here and here. Okay, they insert onto your first rib and your second rib on both sides of your neck. Okay, we have 3 sets of them. You don't have to necessarily worry about the 3 sets of them, but they're all scalene muscles. But you have ones in the front of your neck, you have ones medially, and then you have ones posteriorly to those. So they're named for where they're positioned. Okay, and they're going to help when they contract. They're going to help pull this rib upwards. They're going to help pull this rib upwards to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. Okay, these accessory muscles of respiration act mainly in forced respiration. Okay, so here's a list of muscles that are going to really come into play when respiration is forced. Okay, the erector spinae muscle; those are muscles of your back. Okay, the sternocleidomastoid muscle is another large muscle in the neck. Okay, it goes from the sternum to the clavicle to the mastoid of the skull. Your pectoralis major and pectoralis minor muscles; these are the muscles of your chest. Okay, they help move your arms forward, but they're also going to help increase the volume of your thoracic cavity if they're needed. Serratus anterior are muscles that kind of like connect your lats and your rib cage together. Okay, those are going to also help in increasing thoracic volume. Okay, so now we have 2 types of expiration. We have normal, quiet expiration. Okay, it's very energy saving, passive process. When muscles relax, structures recoil to the original shape and to their original size. And what's the end result is air flowing out of the lungs. Okay, so that's normal, quiet expiration. As you're sitting here watching this video, you're doing that, hopefully. Okay, you're just breathing and air is coming out of your mouth from your lungs. Muscles are relaxing. Structures are, when you inhale, structures are getting larger, but then you exhale, all those structures go back to their original shape. Forced expiration are going to include more things, like what I just did when I just cleared my throat. That's an example of forced expiration. Okay, and what got involved in that forced expiration? My rectus abdominis, my abs got involved in forcing that air out. Okay, whenever you have a cough, okay, you have a heavy cough. I know I have it. I've had it once where I've had a really bad cough for a couple of days. My abs were sore. It's almost like I was doing, crunches or sit-ups for an extended period of time because, my muscles got sore from coughing so much because my rectus abdominis kept contracting every time I coughed. Okay, if you've ever injured a muscle, a rib. Okay, I've broken a rib when I was in college. I broke 2 of my ribs playing baseball, and coughing, sneezing, any type of thing like that, laughing. Okay, those are all kind of forced expiration examples, and those are the rib cage was so painful because of all those muscles. Okay, all of my intercostal muscles. Okay, inside my ribs, all those muscles contracting to get the air forced out of my lungs. Okay, was really, really painful because my ribs were broken and it kept moving the ribs on me. Okay, it wouldn't let them kind of stay together and heal. Okay, other lumbar muscles of the back and abdominal muscles, and also some of your pelvic muscles are going to help expel air out of your lungs. Okay, this greatly increases your abdominal pressure. So let me get this out of here. Okay, pushes the viscera up and against the diaphragm. Okay, so all those, visceral surfaces of your abdominal organs push up against the diaphragm, which increases pressure and then helps to force the air out, right? So underneath your diaphragm, you have your liver, you have your stomach, you have parts of your small intestine, things like that. Those organs get pushed upwards, okay, slightly, and they push on the diaphragm, and that's going to help the diaphragm to, that's going to help the thoracic cavity kind of shrink in volume, which is going to help push air out and out of your mouth, okay? Okay, here are some pictures of those respiratory muscles that I was talking about. So here we have the sternum. Over here is going to be the left-hand side of the person. Okay, the diaphragm is, let me get a marker here. Okay, so here's our diaphragm. Okay, now the rectus abdominis goes over the diaphragm. So this here is the rectus abdominis. Here we have our serratus muscles and our oblique muscles. Okay, and that diaphragm is going to continue to follow that rib cage behind all of these muscles. Okay, but these muscles, and you can see the arrows are going to basically indicate the way that they contract, okay, the way they move. Okay, and you can see which ones are really going to help to, inhale and exhale this air, right? When you want to inhale air, you want this diaphragm moving down, okay, and you can see these arrows moving down, okay, and you can also see when we want to exhale, we see the arrows moving up, and you can see all those things. So like, remember, if I broke a rib here and I broke a rib here, okay, these muscles in between my intercostal muscles, that's what these are. Okay, every time that I coughed or sneezed or laughed, these muscles would contract to try to force air out of my lungs, and thus moving these ribs on me when they're broken. Okay, which was not very pleasant, I'll tell you that. Okay. Neural control of breathing. So let's talk about a little bit about how your nervous system controls your breathing. Your breathing is different than how your heart is involuntary and your breathing is also involuntary, right? You can think about breathing and you can think about stopping breathing, but eventually your brain overrides you and makes you breathe. And that's why people drown, right? You hold your breath underwater because you can consciously hold your breath. But eventually your brain overrides you and says, we need oxygen, you have to breathe. And it forces you to breathe, even though you're underwater. And that's when you inhale water and you drown. Okay. So it is different, but there are some similarities. Okay. There is no autourhythmic pacemaker like in the cells of your heart for respiration. Okay. So when we looked at the cardiovascular system, we looked at these things called nodes, right? These little electrical impulse spots on your heart that keep a rhythmic pattern, right? It keeps the atrias firing at the right time, keeps the ventricles firing at the right time. Okay, it makes sure that the top portion of the heart relaxes and contracts at the proper times in a steady rhythm, right? We don't have that in our respiratory system. Okay, we don't know where that respiratory rhythm comes from. We do have a rhythm of breathing. Okay, our breathing patterns are very rhythmic, but we are unsure about where that rhythm originates neurologically, right? So breathing depends on this repetitive stimulation of skeletal muscles, and the brain is controlling that, right? So the brain controls the diaphragm, the brain controls the muscles of the rib cage and things like that. And all of those electrical impulses come from the brain down the spinal cord into the peripheral nerves, into the muscles that they control. And if you sever the spinal cord high enough in your neck, that will cease the brain being able to give those responses or give those actions, those electrical impulses to the muscles that deal with breathing. So if you sever your spinal cord, you can stop your breathing, okay? And eventually you'll die of suffocation, okay? Skeletal muscles all require nervous stimulation. So if you stop, if you cut the cord, if you cut the spinal cord, you're stopping that nervous stimulation from getting from the brain to the actual muscle. Breathing is controlled at two levels by the brain. One is by is cerebral and is conscious, and the other one is unconscious, and we call that automatic. Okay, the automatic and unconscious breathing is controlled by respiratory centers in the medulla and in the pons. Okay, when we did the brainstem and all the different parts of the brain in semester one in the fall semester, okay, we learned where the medulla and the pons are, and those are going to be the areas that control your breathing. Okay, so in the medulla we have two centers of respiration. Okay, we have the ventral respiratory group, or the VRG. Okay, and that's going to be the primary generator of respiratory rhythm. And this produces a respiratory rhythm of about 12 breaths per minute. Okay, your average human being during rest should breathe about 12 times per minute. Okay, that doesn't seem like a lot. Okay, but that's typically the average. Once you're doing other things, okay, once you start doing some type of activity or motion, like I'm breathing a lot more than 12 breaths per minute because I'm talking, right? And I'm using oxygen at a much higher rate. But you're sitting down, you're relaxing. Maybe you're writing things down, which might increase your breathing rhythms. But for the most part, it's about 12 breaths per minute. Okay. The dorsal respiratory group is the other respiratory center in the medulla, and it modifies the rate and depth of breathing. So the deeper you inhale, the deeper that breath you take. Okay. If you need to take a deeper breath, the dorsal respiratory group will cause you to take a deeper breath. And the reason you take deeper breaths is because you need more oxygen at that particular moment. Okay, so so the ventral respiratory group is going to deal with the rhythmic pattern, and your dorsal respiratory group will deal with how much you breathe. Okay, if that pattern has to increase or decrease, and how deeply you breathe. Are they shallow breaths? Are they deep breaths? Okay, in the pons, you have the Pontine respiratory group, okay, and that modifies the rhythm of the VRG, okay, and it adapts breathing to special circumstances. So if you're sleeping, the pons knows that you're sleeping, your breathing pattern should change during sleep. The pons also knows that your breathing pattern should change during exercise. Okay, when you're exercising, your breathing pattern sometimes will get shorter. Okay, to get short, quick breaths. Okay, depending on what period of exercise you're at. If you're at the beginning of exercise, you might be taking short breaths. At the end, you might be taking big gasping breaths, right? But your pons will control that. Okay, it also adapts breathing when you're talking. So like myself, my pons is working to coordinate my breathing during my speech, right? I'm not sitting here talking for a minute and then I have to take a break to get more oxygen. My pons is working to figure out where to take breaths while I'm talking, okay? Or even while you're singing, that's a type of vocalization, okay? It's pretty interesting. Okay, here is just a flow. You can see where the pons is in the brain and the medulla. Okay, we can see these areas, and we can see how they flow into different spots of the body. Okay, you don't have to, you won't be asked to label this or anything like that. Okay, so let's talk about hyperventilation. You've all heard of the term hyperventilate. And for a long time, I didn't understand why you breathed into a bag when you hyperventilated. Okay, I learned, when I was in college, when I took my first, biology class or anatomy class. Okay, but hyperventilation is usually anxiety triggered, right? And it causes a very rapid breathing, right? People get nervous. They start breathing really fast, really shallow breaths. And what happens when you do that is that you are getting rid of carbon dioxide at a very, very fast rate, okay? So every time you exhale, you're getting rid of carbon dioxide. The faster you exhale, the more carbon dioxide you're going to get rid of at a faster rate. That makes sense. Here's what happens. When you drop your carbon dioxide levels drastically and quickly, that causes the pH of your blood to rise. Okay, carbon dioxide keeps your blood basic. So if you get rid of carbon dioxide too fast, it causes that. Carbon dioxide causes your blood to be acidic. So if you get rid of carbon dioxide too much, it can cause your pH to rise, okay, and become more basic. And what happens there is it causes your cerebral arteries, okay, the arteries in your vein and your brain, okay, to constrict. That constriction of those arteries is what causes dizziness, can cause you to faint. Okay, so in order to stop someone from getting dizzy and fainting, what you do is you have them breathe into a paper bag. The paper bag is going to catch all of the carbon dioxide that's coming out of their mouth. And then when they inhale what's the contents of the bag, they're inhaling the carbon dioxide that they just expired, right? So they exhale into the bag. That bag fills with carbon dioxide from their lungs. They inhale the contents of that bag. So they're re-inhaling the carbon dioxide that they just expelled, thus keeping their pH at the right level and causing their cerebral arteries not to constrict, which is going to cause them hopefully to not get dizzy and not faint. Okay. I found, when I remember learning about that, I'm like, oh, that's why, because it never made sense to me why you would want to breathe in the same air you just breathed out. Okay. I thought you would want to get more oxygen when I first heard that term, when I first saw that procedure. Okay. Let's talk about how airflow can sometimes be restricted in different situations. Okay. When you increase resistance, you decrease the amount of air that can get into your lungs. That makes a lot of common sense. Okay, two things can influence the resistance of air getting into your lungs, and one is the diameter of your bronchioles, so how wide they are, how open they are, and it's something that we call pulmonary compliance. Okay, so the diameter of your bronchioles, or bronchodilation, as you can see here, that's the technical term, bronchodilation. That's the increase in the diameter of your bronchioles. Okay, this can occur with the increase of epinephrine, and that will increase your airflow. Okay, bronchodilation will increase the amount of air getting into your lungs. The opposite of that is bronchoconstriction, which is the decrease in that diameter, right? So that's the bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction, okay? Things that cause that are histamines, right? Histamines are chemicals that could cause allergies, right? And when you are allergic to pollen or dust or ragweed or something like that, your body will produce histamines, which will constrict the airflow in your lungs. So what do? You take an Allegra, you take a Claritin, you take any other type of allergy medication, and usually what's in allergy medications? Antihistamines. Okay. What else can do this? Cold air. Cold air can do that, right? If you are, if you're walking around in, December, January, February outside, it's going to naturally constrict whatever that air touches, right? Because that's what happens when things get cold. When things get cold, they shrink. Okay, so same thing with your bronchioles. If you are inhaling cold air, that cold air is touching all of those respiratory organs that we looked at in the last lecture. Okay, it's going to hit your trachea, go down, hit the bronchioles, and that cold air is going to constrict your bronchioles. Okay, there are chemical irritants. Okay, if you inhale certain things, that can cause bronchoconstriction, and that's going to decrease your airflow. And possibly, if it's very extreme, suffocation can happen. Okay, suffocation can occur from extreme bronchoconstriction, brought about by anaphylactic shock. Okay, brought on by asthma. Okay, anaphylactic shock could occur through allergies, like if you had shellfish and you're allergic to shellfish, or a bee sting. That's extreme bronchoconstriction. Okay. Pulmonary compliance, okay, which is the ease in which lungs can expand, can change due to pressure, like we talked about before, but compliance can be reduced also by lung diseases. Okay. If the lungs are stiffened due to scar tissue during like something like emphysema or lung cancer, okay, the compliance, or the ease at which the lungs can expand, gets reduced, right? We want our pulmonary compliance to be high, okay, so that we can inhale and as much oxygen as we can, as much air as we can, so that we can get as much oxygen as possible. Okay, but if our compliance is reduced because our lungs are stiffened by scar tissue, then our compliance is reduced and we do not get as much oxygen into our lungs, and breathing is much harder. Okay, let's take a look at some variations in respiratory rhythms. So eupnea, okay, is relaxed, quiet breathing. Okay, your tidal volume is about 500 milliliters. Your respiratory rate is about 12 to 15 breaths per minute. Okay, that is normal, relaxed, quiet breathing. Okay, eupnea. Then you have apnea. Okay, you've all heard of sleep apnea. Okay, and that is when you stop breathing, right? Apnea is temporary stopping of your breathing. Okay, it's not, it lasts for short little snippets of time. But when you're sleeping and you stop breathing during sleep, that is going to affect, obviously, how well you sleep. It's going to affect how much oxygen you're getting while you're sleeping. People with sleep apnea wake up very groggy. They tend to be tired a lot of the time because they don't sleep well, because during their sleeping, their breathing is being interrupted. A lot of times people with sleep apnea have to wear special face masks that give them oxygen while they're sleeping to kind of help stop this apnea from happening. Okay, dyspnea. Okay, dyspnea is labored or gasping breathing, shortness of breath. Okay, hyperpnea is increased rate and depth of breathing in response to exercise, pain, or other conditions. That's fairly normal, right? Hyperpnea is fairly normal. Okay, it happens to us all the time. Our rate of breathing, our depth of breathing changes normally throughout the day. Okay, if we're exercising or if we're in pain or other conditions, we might experience hyperpnea. Hyperventilation, we talked about that already, which was the increase of or the rapid decrease of carbon dioxide. Then you have the opposite of hyperventilation, which is called hypoventilation. Okay, hypoventilation is reduced pulmonary ventilation, leading to an increase in carbon dioxide. Okay, so if you have too much carbon dioxide, not good. If you don't have enough carbon dioxide too rapidly, okay, that's also not good, right? Because it can change the pH of your blood, right? Getting rid of carbon dioxide too quickly will cause the pH to rise. Having too much carbon dioxide in your system will cause your pH to reduce down. Okay, and you want it to be in a certain level. You don't want it too low. You don't want it too high. Just kind of like everything in life, everything in moderation. Orthopnea, okay, is dyspnea that occurs when a person is lying down. Okay, it's those gaspings of breath if you were lying down, right? If we go back one, okay, this dyspnea is labored gasping breaths, shortness of breath. If that's occurring while you're lying down, we call that orthopnea. Okay, sometimes in certain individuals that will only happen to them while they're lying down. They'll be fine. They won't really get dyspnea while standing upright. But when they're lying down, they have issues, and they can find that that's occurring when they're lying down. Okay, respiratory arrest, that is permanent cessation of breathing. Okay, that is not good. You don't want respiratory arrest. That's kind of like cardiac arrest, right? It's when your heart stops, right? Respiratory arrest is when breathing stops. And then you have tachypnea. Tachypnea is accelerated respiration. Okay, common when doing exercise, but you always want tachypnea to stop. Okay, when you stop doing that particular function. Okay, the air that you breathe. Okay, here's the composition of air by chemical or compound. Okay, most of the air that you breathe is nitrogen. Almost 80% of the air that you inhale is nitrogen. Okay, only 20%, or close to 21% of the air that you breathe is actually oxygen. There's a very, very slight portion of the air that you breathe that's composed of carbon dioxide, and the remainder, which is very, very low, is water vapor. And the water vapor content of the air will depend on the temperature of that air and the humidity of that air, right? The colder that air gets, it tends to be less humid, okay? It tends to be drier, right? When it gets cold outside, the air gets dry. That's why you get, sinus problems. You get bloody noses, things like that, because your mucous membranes are drying out, okay? Minor gases are also found in air, like argon, neon, helium, methane, ozone. Those are all things found in the air that you breathe, but in extremely, extremely trace percentages. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Let's talk about that a little bit. That is something that basically everyone knows or has heard about. Okay, carbon monoxide is CO, okay, as opposed to carbon dioxide, which is CO2. Okay. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas. It's found in cigarette smoke. It's found in car exhausts. It's found in the fumes from gas furnaces. Basically, if you think about it, whenever you burn something made of carbon, you get carbon monoxide as a byproduct. Okay, so fossil fuels and wood and other plant products, they're basically just made of straight up carbon. Okay, if you burn coal, if you burn gasoline, those are fossil fuels that are strictly made of carbon. So when you burn them, you're releasing carbon monoxide into the air around that particular thing, right? Natural gas, again, it's a fossil fuel made of carbon. Okay, cigarette smoke. What are you burning in cigarettes? You're burning, plant product, right? Along with a whole bunch of other chemicals, but the actual tobacco is plant. It's leaves of plants, and leaves of plants are, organic, and they contain carbon, and they're going to release carbon monoxide into the air. Okay, what happens with carbon monoxide is that it wants to bond to hemoglobin. That's what this HB is here. Okay. But the thing that's supposed to bond with hemoglobin in your blood is oxygen. Okay, that's what hemoglobin is there to do. Hemoglobin is there to bond to the oxygen so that it can carry the oxygen from your lungs to your muscles and to your other organs that need that oxygen. What carbon monoxide does, carbon monoxide competes with the oxygen, or competes for that binding site with that oxygen, right? So instead of just the oxygen bonding to the hemoglobin, this carbon monoxide wants to bond to the hemoglobin, and it does, right? It will bond to the hemoglobin, which reduces the amount of oxygen that's bonding to the hemoglobin, which means that oxygen that isn't bonding is not going to get to the organs that need it, right? The oxygen is there so that it can go to organs so that it can produce energy. If that oxygen doesn't get onto the hemoglobin, it never gets transported to the organ, and that organ loses out on oxygen. And what happens when an organ loses out on oxygen? It dies. All right, think of it as like a two people trying to get a taxi cab, right? The taxi cab is the hemoglobin. The people, are either oxygen or carbon monoxide, right? Normally the oxygen person would get into the cab and go to where it needs to go so that it can do its job. But instead, some other jerk comes and hops in the cab before the oxygen person gets in and uses that cab. And that oxygen is just left standing there waiting for another cab, right? So that's my really loose analogy for that, but maybe it works. Okay, carboxyhemoglobin. This is, CO2 that binds to iron of the hemoglobin. That's basically the chemistry of that. Okay, it bonds to hemoglobin 210 times as tightly as oxygen, right? So the competition is very influential here. Okay, it ties up the hemoglobin for a very long time. Okay, and therefore that oxygen cannot get to where it needs to go to be used for energy production. For non-smokers, less than 1.5% of hemoglobin is occupied by carbon monoxide. Okay, that's a good thing. Okay, that means 98.5% of your hemoglobin is working properly, getting oxygen to where it needs to go for someone who's a non-smoker. For someone who is a smoker, 10% of hemoglobin is occupied by carbon monoxide. Okay, that's insane. Okay, 10% of hemoglobin is occupied by carbon dioxide. okay, in people who smoke heavily. Okay, that's a lot. Okay, it's 10 times worse than if you did not smoke. Okay, the atmospheric concentration of carbon monoxide is about, if it reaches 0.02, that is very, very lethal. Okay, you don't want atmospheric concentration of carbon monoxide to reach 0.2, which is very high. Okay. Causes of increased respiration during exercise. So let's talk about how respiration is affected by exercise. That's something a lot of us do. Something maybe a lot of us want to do. We want to exercise a lot, or we try to. But when the brain sends motor commands to the muscles, it also sends information to the respiratory centers, right? So when your brain sends a motor command, which means a motor command is a electrical impulse to control a muscle to do some type of action, right? When you're writing something down, that's a motor response. That's a motor control. Okay. So when your brain sends a command to a muscle, it's smart enough to also tell the respiratory system, listen, I just sent a motor impulse to this muscle. I'm just giving you a heads up because the increased muscle action is going to need an increased supply of oxygen, right? Because the more you use the muscles, the more oxygen the muscle uses, the more oxygen the muscle is going to need, right? You have to replenish all the oxygen that the muscle is using during the action, okay? So the brain is going to send the same basic information to the respiratory centers when it sends a neurological impulse to the actual muscle it's controlling. They increase pulmonary ventilation in anticipation of the needs of the exercising muscles. Okay, so the amount of inhalation is going to increase, and the amount of expiration is going to increase when your muscles are doing some type of action or activity. Okay. Exercise also stimulates proprio receptors of muscles and joints. Okay, they are going to transmit excitatory signals to the brainstem and the respiratory centers, and they're going to increase breathing because they are informed that the muscles are going to be moving. Okay, so proprio receptors are going to be receptors that allow you to know where other parts of your body are, right? And you want to know when you're running, you want to know where your feet are in relationships to your other foot, right? You want your left foot to know what your right foot is doing, and so on and so forth, so that you can do the proper exercise, you can do the proper movements that you want to do. Okay, the last thing that we want to talk about in this lecture is respiratory disorders. Okay, so one respiratory disorder deals with oxygen imbalances, and hypoxia is a deficiency of oxygen or the inability to use oxygen, and this is usually a consequence of some type of respiratory disease. Okay, so anytime you have a deficiency of oxygen, it's considered to be hypoxia. So, but there are different types of hypoxia. So hypozemic hypoxia, okay, is when you have low arterial oxygen, okay, when your arteries are lacking in oxygen. This is usually due to inadequate pulmonary gas exchange, which means the gases in your lungs are not being exchanged, right? So when you inhale, the oxygen that gets into your alveoli is not getting exchanged for carbon dioxide for some reason, right? What are those reasons? Those reasons could be oxygen deficiency. Maybe you're in an environment that doesn't have a lot of oxygen, right? It's not necessarily your fault. Maybe it's not necessarily that you have a disease, but it's just the environment that you're in is low in oxygen, right? And if you're in an area that's low in oxygen, eventually you will become low in oxygen because you're using the environment around you. And if they don't have enough oxygen, you're not going to get enough oxygen. Impaired ventilation, okay? For example, drowning, okay? Underwater, you cannot ventilate properly. Maybe something is aspired into your lung, okay? Aspiration of a foreign body, you've breathed in something foreign, right? And we talked how unlikely that is, but it can happen, okay? Respiratory arrest, maybe you for some reason you have stopped breathing for some reason. and sometimes it can be lung diseases. So these are all reasons for hypoxia to occur. Okay, those are all reasons for hypoxia to happen. Ischemic hypoxia is inadequate circulation of blood. Most of the time, this is due to some type of congenital heart failure, right? The only reason the blood not circulating properly is going to be because your heart isn't pumping properly, which is what we call congestive heart failure. Anemic hypoxia. Okay, if you've heard the term anemic before, and that typically a lot of times anemic people or people who are anemic have some type of iron deficiency. Okay, and anemic hypoxia is typically due to an inability of the blood to carry adequate oxygen. Okay, and a lot of times that is due to the insufficient amount of iron in the body. Histotoxic hypoxia. Histo means blood, toxic means chemical, right? So histotoxic hypoxia, or the reduction of oxygen due to some type of chemical, okay, could happen by metabolic poisons. Okay, cyanide is considered a metabolic poison, and what will happen with cyanide poisoning is that there's something in the in cellular respiration. We talked very, very briefly about cellular respiration in the last lecture with electron transport chains. Okay, the electron transport chain is this area in the mitochondria where electrons move down a gradient so that ATP can be produced. Well, oxygen is used for that electron transport chain, and if you take away the oxygen, the electron transport chain stops working, and therefore you can't make ATP, which is the energy that all your cells use to stay alive, right? So that's one example. Okay, cyanosis. Cyanosis ends up giving you something called blueness of the skin. Okay, and there's, if you look it up, there are these people called the blue people of Kentucky, and they were like I don't want to say a tribe, but they were like a group of people that were very isolated from the rest of the world. Kind of like the Amish, but very similar. And they had this genetic disorder that was passed down from parent to offspring in their group of people that caused their skin to be blue, and it's due to their blood not being able to carry oxygen as well as it should. Okay, some more oxygen imbalances. Although safe to breathe, 100% oxygen at 1 atmospheric pressure for a few hours, oxygen toxicity can develop when pure oxygen is breathed at 2.5 atmospheric pressures or greater. So what we are not breathing 100% oxygen. Like you saw before, when you breathe in air, only about 20% of that air is oxygen. About 78% of it was nitrogen, and the rest was other things. Oxygen is a very caustic molecule. A lot of things cannot live in oxygen. Okay, oxygen causes rust, right? When oxygen comes into contact with metals, it causes that metal to rust and break down. Okay, so 100% oxygen would not be really good for us. Okay, and why that is it produces things called free radicals, like hydrogen peroxide, that's H2O2. And we use H2O2 to kill bacteria, right? We kill living things with hydrogen peroxide. Okay, it can destroy enzymes. Okay, 100% oxygen can cause enzymes to break down, and we rely heavily on enzymes for chemical processes or metabolic processes in the human body. It could damage nervous tissue. It could lead to seizures, coma, even death. So you don't want 100% oxygen. People who are given 100% oxygen, like in oxygen masks with the canisters and stuff like that, those are people whose lungs are not working properly, and even if they're given 100% oxygen, they're not getting 100% oxygen, right? So it's kind of like overcompensation. Okay, you've probably heard this term COPD. Okay, you've probably heard that term on drug commercials. Okay, a lot of drug commercials are tell you that this drug is a COPD, or don't take this drug if you're on COPDs, right? What COPD stands for is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's long-term obstruction of airflow. Okay, and it substantially reduces the pulmonary ventilation. It substantially reduces the amount of air you can inhale or exhale. Okay. The major chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases are bronchitis, chronic bronchitis, which is the chronic inflammation or constant inflammation of the bronchi in the lungs, and emphysema. Okay. Both of these, you really only get chronic bronchitis. You can get bronchitis, here and there, but if it becomes chronic, there's usually a reason or something in your environment causing that inflammation to constantly show up and constantly be there. Most of the time, that's due to smoking. Okay. Same thing with emphysema. You can get emphysema by not smoking, but there's something that's constantly getting into your system causing this inflammation. Okay. And if we look at human beings and we look at statistics of people who have emphysema or who have chronic bronchitis, the overwhelming majority of the people who suffer from those two diseases are going to be people who smoked or people who are around, atmosphere where they were inhaling things they should not have been inhaling. Okay. Other risk factors include air pollution, right? Like I said before, you're surrounded by something, you're inhaling something you shouldn't be inhaling. Occupational exposure to airborne irritants. Okay. People that do industrial cleaning, okay, should be wearing masks. Things like that. People who work with like spray paint, or if they paint cars, or if they paint guitars or something like that, those paints can irritate your lungs if you inhale them. Okay, anything in an aerosol can, you shouldn't really inhale anything in an aerosol can. That's why I don't like air fresheners. I don't like necessarily like spray Lysols and things like in an aerosol. I like using the actual liquid or burning an oil to freshen the air or something like that. I don't like aerosol cans because those things can harm your pulmonary circuit, or your pulmonary ventilation rather. Okay. It could also be caused by heredity, right? You can inherit some type of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay, so chronic bronchitis is the severe persistent inflammation of the lower respiratory tract where the bronchi are. That's where the trachea breaks off into two different sections to go into the lungs. Okay, we talked about goblet cells in the last lecture. Goblet cells are these cells that are going to produce mucus so that the ciliated epithelial cells have mucus to move around and catch irritants or debris that gets into the lungs. Okay, chronic bronchitis will enlarge goblet cells to produce excess mucus. Okay, and that excess mucus is actually going to immobilize your cilia, right? We want the cilia to have mucus, but if you have too much mucus, it causes the cilia to kind of get trapped in the mucus, and it can't remove dirty mucus. It can't get rid of the dirty mucus. And what happens if you have dirty mucus stuck in your lungs that can't move? You get bacterial growth. Okay, and that's not a good thing. Okay, we want that mucus to freely move out of the lungs into our digestive system so that we can get rid of it, or out of our nose so that we can blow our nose, out of our throat when we cough. We want that mucus to move. If it becomes too thick, or if it becomes too much in quantity, okay, the cilia can't move, right? The cilia can only do so much, and once they're overwhelmed, they can't move, and then the mucus stays there. And whenever mucus stays in one place for too long, bacteria are going to start growing in it, and then you'll get infections. Okay. Smoking compromises the function of macrophages. Macrophages are these cells that eat debris and eat bacterial cells, and smoking is going to stop those alveolar macrophages from functioning properly. Okay. Development of a chronic cough could happen. Okay. If you have chronic bronchitis, you can cough a lot. And when you cough, you bring up something called sputum, and that sputum is thick mucus with cellular debris. Okay, and that's going to be that green, brown, yellow mucus that comes up out of your throat. If you've ever had something like that, and that could be caused by, again, smoking or other types of conditions. Okay, some symptoms of chronic bronchitis are that hypozemia and the cyanosis. Okay, that can happen with chronic bronchitis. Okay, emphysema Okay, going back to that, this is where the walls of the alveolar break down. Okay, so the alveolar, that's the area where gas exchange happens, right? That we really need those areas, because that's where the oxygen is going to get in, carbon dioxide is going to get out, right? Very important. So when someone who's has emphysema, those walls break down of those alveolar, which means you're going to have less surface area for oxygen and carbon dioxide to be exchanged, which means you're not inhaling as much oxygen as you used to, right? The lungs become less elastic. Okay, they become stiffer. Okay, which is not going to allow them to the volume of them to increase and gain as much oxygen as possible. The air passages can collapse in emphysema. Okay, which is going to obstruct the airflow. Right, you're going to have obstruction of airflow. And that's also going to cause air to be trapped in the lungs. And when air becomes trapped in the lungs, the person can become barrel chested. Okay, their chest is the size of their chest is increasing. The volume isn't necessarily increasing, but the size is increasing because the air keeps getting trapped. It can't get out of the lungs. This is also going to weaken the muscles of the thoracic cavity. And someone who has emphysema is going to have to use much more energy, much more time to exhale and inhale than someone who does not have emphysema, because their muscles are weakened and they're going to have to use a lot more energy, a lot more force. And when you're weakened to begin with, you're kind of lacking on force and energy. So your breathing becomes very, very labored. Okay, lung cancer. Okay, let's talk about, the elephant in the room. Nobody likes talking about cancer, but it's something we should all know about. Okay, lung cancer accounts for more deaths than any other cancer in the world. Okay, the most important cause of lung cancer is smoking. Okay, there are at least 60 carcinogens in cigarettes. Okay, a carcinogen is something that causes cancer. So when you smoke a cigarette, you are willingly putting 60 different types of carcinogens into your cells. That should be enough to make you not smoke. Okay, but I smoked for like 10 years, so I get it. Okay, once I had children, I stopped smoking because I want to increase my lifespan, so I can spend more time with them as much as I can. But squamosal cell carcinoma is the most common form. Okay, squamosal cell carcinoma invades the bronchial walls. Okay, the bronchi of the lungs, right before the lungs. This can cause bleeding lesions and cause you to cough up blood. Okay, that's why people with lung cancer can cough up blood. Okay, because bleeding can occur due to these lesions in the bronchioles. Dense swirls of keratin replace functional respiratory tissue. Okay, keratin, we spoke about keratin in the integumentary system. Keratin is basically this chemical that is put into dead skin cells, so that your dead skin cells can kind of act like shingles, like they're almost like armor, right? You don't want that in your lungs, right? You want your lungs to be moist, very alive cells that can absorb oxygen or diffuse carbon dioxide. If your cells become like armor plates that are keratinized, they're not going to be able to do any of those functions, which means you're not going to breathe as good, which means you're not getting its oxygen as good, which means you could potentially, you can potentially die from that. Adenocarcinoma. Okay, these are going to originate in the mucus glands of your lungs. We have small cell carcinoma. It can also be called oat cell carcinoma because the cells kind of look like oat grains. This is the least common type of carcinoma in the lung, but it's the most dangerous. And the reason that it's most dangerous is because it metastasizes very quickly. This term metastasis or metastasize refers to the movement from one location to another, right? So when someone has lung cancer, then it goes to their bones, and then it goes to their brain, then it goes to their intestines. That's called metastasization, right? It metastasizes. It moves from one place to another. So these small cell carcinomas, they originate in the bronchi, but they can metastasize to the mediastinum, which is near the heart. they can metastasize to other organs. Okay, and that's very dangerous. Once you have cancer in multiple locations, it becomes much harder to deal with as far as giving you medications and giving you treatments and things like that. So the percentage of survival decreases a lot once you have cancer in multiple places, because then you have to beat cancer in multiple places. It's not good enough just to beat the lung cancer. You have to beat the cancer in the lung and in the bone and in the brain and everywhere else, and that just isn't good. Okay. 90% of lung cancers originate in mucous membranes of the bronchi. The tumors invade the bronchial walls. Those tumors are going to compress the airways, so you're not going to get as much oxygen. Often the first sign of lung cancer is coughing up blood. A lot of times people find lung cancers when they don't even have any symptoms. Okay, people go for a checkup, people go for a physical. People might have some discomfort, but nothing too serious. And then they go to the doctor, and then the doctor gives them a chest X-ray, and they find a tumor. Okay, but sometimes, the first symptom you get, or the first, thing that you find, is that you're coughing up blood, and coughing up blood is never a good sign. You don't want to see blood in your mucus from your lungs. Okay, you can get blood in your mucus from like your nose, because your nasal membranes could bleed due to the air being too dry, things like that. But you don't want it coming from your lungs. You don't want to see blood coming up from your lungs. Okay. Like I said, these metastasize very rapidly. Usually occurs by the time of diagnosis. So when you're coughing up blood, there's a pretty good chance that when you go to the doctor after coughing up blood, that tumor is already in more than one spot. Okay. Unfortunately, by the time you get diagnosed after coughing up blood, there's a pretty good chance that that tumor is in your lungs, but it's also somewhere else. Okay, common sites of metastasizing or metastasis. Okay, like I said, it can travel from the lung to the heart or the pericardium. It can travel from the lung to the bones, to the liver, to the lymph nodes, to the brain. Okay, my aunt just passed away in August of lung cancer. The primary cancer she had was lung cancer, but they found it all over her. They found it in her brain. They found it in her bones. They found it in her spleen and her pancreas. Okay, they found it all over the place. And she had just got diagnosed in June, right? So it was late June, and she passed away mid-August. So it was very quick moving. Okay, prognosis is poor after your diagnosis. Only 7% of patients survive 5 years of lung cancer. Now I did have a family member who lived quite a bit after she found out she had lung cancer. They removed one of her lungs. The thing was, it didn't metastasize, and that's why she lived an extra 10, 15 years after her initial diagnosis of lung cancer. It didn't, for her, she was lucky, it did not metastasize to other places, or they caught it before it metastasized. So they were able to remove a lung, and then bought her a lot of time. But it came back. It came back in different forms. Okay, and the last slide here I want to show you here is this is a healthy lung. Okay, this is what a lung should look like. As far as, this lung is technically dead, right? Because it's not in a human anymore. Okay, so this is what a healthy lung removed from a healthy human being after death looks like. And this is what a lung looks like with carcinoma. So this is what lung cancer looks like. And you can see tumors here, this large white ball of cells, tumor. See tumors here. Okay, tumor here. Okay, and it's black. And the blackness is due to the tar that's in the cigarettes. Okay, the tar that they put down on the street is the same tar that they put in cigarettes. And every cigarette has a very minute amount of tar in it. But if you smoke for 30, 40, 50 years, okay, you might have, like I said in another lecture, you might have an ounce or 2 ounces of tar over 30 or 40 years. And if I took a shot, right, if you took a shot glass of tar and just rubbed it over the surface of a lung, that's what it's going to look like. Okay, that's what it's going to look like. So that is going to be the end of this particular lecture. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below, or you can email me. You know my email address. And I will see you next lecture. Have a good one.